Now, some of you may not know this, but I am contractually obligated to talk about National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation every Christmas sermon that we do. It's part of the contract. It's in the fine print. I think Eddie Creighton put that in there. But I love that movie. It's not Christmas until we watch that movie a few times as a family, and we fast forward through a few parts, but we turn the volume all the way down. But I love that movie for a lot of different reasons. It feels like a fun dysfunctional family where everything doesn't have to go right, and they still understand, I guess, the meaning of Christmas. But as I've grown older, I became obsessed with one particular scene. And you've heard me talk about it before. I've shared this clip in sermons and in lessons before. But it's the lighting scene. And so we're going to show that real quick. And then I want to explain to you why I love that scene so much. So stand whenever you're ready.
Honey, I think I know what's wrong. I can't see. No.
The older I get, the reason why I love that clip is when the nuclear reactor thing goes off. Because there's that quick, probably like 2 to 3 seconds, where the only house lit up in the entire community is the Griswold's home. Now, obviously, they're making fun of how much power that house is using. But there is something about light in darkness that I love. This is the hardest time of the year for me, because I hate how early it gets dark. It bums me out. 4:30, basically the day is over. Now, we have wonderful neighbors in Echo Valley who have been decorating for Christmas, I think, since right after Halloween. They have gone hard in the paint with that. And that has been something that I've realized, I really love doing. When I drive home, I hit Millbrook, and then when I turn left onto Echo Valley, I can see this house. I won't say whose house it is, but he's an Oregon Ducks fan. So depending on game day, this house is lit up with green lights, and then the rest of the holiday season, it's Christmas themed. And for a long time, I thought, this is just something funny that the Waddells do. But then I realized how much I needed to see the light in this dark period of the year. There's something powerful about seeing about seeing light in the darkness. And because I am a nerd, I started looking at where did Christmas lights even develop? And it's a really fun story. Normally when people tell you it's a really fun story, it's not, but I promise you it is. Christmas lights were developed by two individuals in the late 1800s. The first guy on the left is going to be Edward Johnson, and the guy on the right is going to be Thomas Edison. Probably individuals that you're familiar with Edison, but maybe not so much with Edward Johnson. They worked in tandem together, where Edison would come up with a lot of the inventions and the ideas and how things work together. And Edward Johnson was the showman of the pair. So when Edison would have this invention that he would want to give to the world, Johnson would be the one who sold it to the world, which is where we get to this concept of Christmas lights. Because Edison became obsessed with this idea of electrical lights that were colorful. And so he paired together with Edward Johnson and said, let's do this, let's work together. And so what they do is they take these strands of lights, kind of the same concept that we have today, with a small light, and they put these colorful bulbs on them. Now, this is where Edward Johnson kind of comes into the scene, because Edison has this idea with light bulbs. He knows that he wants them to be colorful, and he knows that he wants them to be kind of associated with the holiday season. And so Edward Johnson comes up with this idea, let's put them around a Christmas tree. And what they do is they reach out to the Detroit Times and the Tribune. For some reason, he's in New York City, but he calls the Detroit Times. I don't really understand that, but he's long gone, so we can't ask him. But he calls two newspapers, and he tells them, you need to come see this house, this parlor in Murray Park. He doesn't tell them what they've done. He just tells them, you've got to come see this thing. So these reporters show up to this house, and they see this particular tree. It kind of looks Charlie Brownish, right? But they see this tree, and it's illuminated. Now, we have seen trees with Christmas lights our entire lives. We have them in this room, in the lobby, all over our campus. But imagine for just a moment that you've never seen this before in your life. And the other fantastic thing that Edward Johnson did was he invited children. So you've got kids, probably bad kids, who are running around this Christmas tree just looking at this in awe. They've never seen anything like this before. Now, what has been undersold about this Christmas tree is that it also rotated, which we don't ever talk about that. We only obsess over the lights. But this tree that Johnson and Edison made rotated. Now, the Detroit Times wrote an article about this, saying that they have never seen kids more filled with wonder than seeing these illuminated eggs on this tree. Now, I thought that was a silly way to describe this, but if you think about it, they've never seen this before. Now, these lights, for me, when you look at the 1800s, changed everything with how society celebrated Christmas. In 1894, the White House used these same light bulbs with the Cleveland administration. And so it ballooned and took off in this way that I don't even know if Edison or Johnson assumed that it would. But more than any of that, it changed how people celebrated, or at least decorated for Christmas. These small light bulbs that were strung together on one electric string, again, changed everything. It's a fascinating story about how something small can change the trajectory for how people celebrate Christmas. Over the last few weeks, we've looked at the different elements within the Christmas story that changed everything, that come from unlikely places, unlikely people, unlikely social groups. We started with Nazareth, this small village of about 600, 900 people in the Jezreel Valley that was so insignificant that when Nathanael in John chapter 1 heard that the Messiah was from Nazareth, he said, how could anything good come from Nazareth? It was this small, insignificant town that was overlooked, that was often forgotten, yet God said, I'm not going to forget about it. In fact, this very place, in this valley that was known for its Old Testament battles, would be the place where the Prince of Peace rose. God can use unexpected locations to show you that God is not done working. That although the world may forget, the world may overlook, God does not. And then we talked about Mary, this young woman who's likely 13 to 16 years old, who is just preparing for her life with Joseph, going through her daily tasks and requirements, and then finally understanding that, hey, she's betrothed to Joseph. She's going to be married to him. She's going to start a new life, have a whole new experience. But an angel of the Lord shows up and tells her, Mary, the Lord is with you. We talked about how those words were striking. Because anytime that we see the words, the Lord is with you in Scripture, that individual is called to do something. It's often something bigger than them. It's something that's probably intimidating and scary. And this individual, Mary, those words are said to her, and a lot of us would have run away. We said, God, not me, not now. God, I've got these plans for my life, but Mary says, I am the Lord's servant. Again, this woman who we look at and we say, how in the world is she so brave and courageous? God said, this is my servant. And then last week we spent time talking about the Magi and the shepherds. The Magi being individuals from the outside, from the far east, who see this star and they go to Herod and they're like, hey, we're seeing something. There's something divine that's happening here in this moment, in this season, right now. Do you see it? And all Herod sees is somebody trying to claim his throne. We also talked about the shepherds, social outcasts, who were deemed to be unclean and unworthy to carry any type of message, yet God chooses the shepherds. to be the individuals that visit the Messiah and share that good news with everyone that they encounter. These are revolutionary stories where everything changes in that moment, which brings us to the text this morning of Luke chapter 2. Luke frames the story in sending Joseph and Mary to Bethlehem. And he does this by saying that there is a census that has been taking place. So in verse 4, so Joseph also went up from the town of Nazareth in Galilee to Judea, to Bethlehem, the town of David, because he belonged to the house and line of David. He went there to register with Mary, who was pledged to be married to him and was expecting a child. This is how Luke begins this birth story. Now, it's easy for us to read the story as we always have, that we know how the story develops, we know how this story ends. But if we're honest with ourselves, if we're reading it like we've never read it before, we are anticipating fanfare. We are anticipating celebration, fireworks, trumpets, people heralding that this is the moment that the Messiah enters into the world. And Luke is kind of leading us into that. Because Luke is referencing prophetic text, signaling that something divine, something big is about to happen. That the birth will be taking place in Bethlehem, that's prophetic. The connection to the house of David, that's prophetic. It's all lining up, but what Luke says next blows my mind if we read it that way. If you read it in a sense that we've maybe never read this story before, when Luke writes this, while they were there, the time came for the baby to be born. It's almost like flatlining. There's no excitement. There's no fireworks. There's nothing that's blowing the story out of the water. Luke just kind of says, hey, when they were there, it was time for the baby to be born. I believe that Luke is a talented, brilliant historian. And the way that he writes about the parables and the interactions of Jesus are beautiful to me. And they paint a picture of a real Jesus doing things. But I'm like, Luke, did you not have any other details you could have given us? Nothing. So maybe in the next verse, Luke is going to add a little bit more to the story to bring it out, to make it more exciting. But then in verse 7, Luke writes, and she gave birth to her firstborn, a son. She wrapped him in cloths and placed him in a manger because there was no guest room available for them. There's no fanfare. There's no excitement. There's no celebration that the Messiah is here. In fact, all we take away from verse 7 is that Joseph didn't book a room. Thank you, whoever laughed. I appreciate that. But think about that for just a moment. The Messiah entering into the world, there's nothing that celebrates it. But friends, I think that's the point. I think the reason why Jesus enters into the world this way is not to say, look at the fireworks, listen to the trumpets, look at the parades that's happening. It's, are you paying attention? Do you have your ear close enough to the ground to see what God is doing? God enters the world in this humble, gentle way. Not to blow us out of the water, but more to remind us that we're not alone. It's this gentle, powerful way that draws us in, that forces us to be quiet and listen and pay attention, to see the humble and gentle way that Jesus enters into this world. I love that about this story. Because so often in the world that we live in, if it's not exciting, if it's not flashy, if it doesn't blow us away, we're like, oh, did it even happen? This is one of those stories that if you're not paying attention, you're going to miss it. I think that's why Luke framed it this way. This quiet, gentle way. To say God is with us. It's powerful when you slow down enough to hear what God is doing. But back to Christmas lights for just a little bit longer. As I was looking at this concept of how Christmas lights develop, I started seeing a bunch of ads that Edward Johnson and Thomas Edison put out around the late 1800s saying a safer alternative. And I thought, strange. Like, I have kids. I want my kids to be safe. I want my home to be safe. But you see this all over the place in the ads that they were putting out in the late 1800s. The reason why they put out that this was a safer alternative, for those of you who are not Christmas historians like myself, people used to put candles in Christmas trees. Like real candles, not pretend candles like we have at the candlelight for the kids who are like, they're like, this is not a real candle. They put real candles in Christmas trees. And they did this, friends, for hundreds of years. It wasn't like one person was like, hey, watch this. People did this for a very long time. Now, albeit, they didn't let the candles burn all night long. It was normally during a period of engagement. You're maybe around the trees. You're not letting them just go all night long. But this is let's agree on this, a terrible idea to do. To put a candle in an actual tree. And that's what Johnson and Edison were combating. They said, what if we didn't burn our homes down on Christmas and we just had electrical lights that you could plug in and plug out when you're not at home? And so they're combating this. But I went deeper because this develops out of the German tradition of the Yule log, which is where you would go out into the woods, you would find a gigantic log, and then you would shove it into your fireplace. Now, they did this because of the illumination element. The German Yule log tradition started as a way to combat the darkness in this time of year. And I was like, man, I was like, this will preach, you know? The Yule log, they do this for a very long time until eventually they start putting the candles in trees. But the Yule log thing was really interesting to me for a lot of different reasons, but more so that they knew that this was the darkest time of the year. And they also recognized that light would bring people together. That light in the darkness would draw people in. Which made me go just one step deeper into actual matches. If you've ever had the power go off in your house and like it's the time where you're like, I have no batteries, these flashlights don't work anymore, the kids have run down the batteries, and you have to light a candle, you know the impact, especially if it's dark, of striking a match. Now, I've never looked into this before this, but a match is actually a chemical reaction. Again, I went to seminary, we didn't cover this. Tables and chairs, internet, that's all we did. We didn't do science. But a match is a chemical reaction. And so there's a chemical compound in the top part of the match that when it strikes the flint on the side of like a matchbox, and it combines with the oxygen in the air, I know, I did research. The oxygen in the air, it forms that flame. Again, just from a small strike of a match, a room can be illuminated. A candle can be lit. But one of the nerds that was writing about how the chemical compound works wrote that the fascinating thing about striking a match is that once that chemical reaction has happened, the match can never go back to its original state. That's what happened at Christmas. A match was lit, albeit just one small, tiny, infant match was lit. But with that match being lit, the world would never be the same. It could never go back to the way it was because once God entered the world in this way, humans were told that you have hope, you have purpose, you have salvation. One of the prophecies connected to this is Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14, that reads, "Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son and will call him Emmanuel," which means God with us. Christmas is, of course, a time to celebrate family and friends and togetherness. But more than that, I believe it's that gentle light that enters the world that reminds us that we are not alone. That although we combat the darkness of the world, we have a light that is with us, that has not abandoned us, that has not forgot us, that gives us reason to hope and to live. Because with the coming of the Messiah, God is telling us, We are not alone. Let's stand and sing together.
Your only Son, no sin to hide, but you have